Hello, people. So I meant to do this about a week ago when I actually saw the film, but here we go. I watched the recut, the edited version, director's cut, of Rocky versus Drago. That's the marketed title. It's Rocky 4, basically. Now, for any fans of the Rocky series, I think there's a pretty much universal consensus that Rocky 4 is the best film in that series, or at least it's a very strong contender for the best. Um, I've never come across anyone that doesn't like it, who are fans of the Rocky series. For me, it is definitely the best. And I think what people liked about that film was well, firstly, it was kind of a cultural symbol of the times. It was very much an 80s film, had the Cold War overtones. I probably should say a few words for people who haven't seen it, and this is a spoiler. It's a 1985 film, the year I was born. Basically, the main protagonist, Rocky Balboa, is an Italian American fighter. He's kind of the hero of the series. He started off as an unknown fighter. He rose up. He was given this opportunity at the world title, and yeah, it kind of follows his journey through the boxing world in these films. Um, and by the time we get to Rocky Four, this Russian guy, Ivan Drago, comes to the United States and what's billed as an exhibition match, a little bit like the ping pong diplomacy between China and the United States of the 70s, something like that. Um, Now, Drago is an amateur. However, he's a huge guy, incredibly powerful. It's implied but not explicitly stated that there's some doping going on because it shows him getting injected at several points in the film, and his strength's almost inhuman. It's almost like a superhero or something. And that aura of Ivan Drago, I think, was always a very powerful thing. I mean, the other opponents also stood out, like Mr. T and Apollo for that matter, but with Ivan Drago, it was something else. Um, anyway, he comes to the States for this exhibition match. Apollo comes out of retirement to fight him, and basically, spoiler here, he dies in the ring. It's a very dramatic scene, and Rocky's devastated, everyone's devastated, and the Russians are kind of defensive about it, but it was clearly quite malicious the way it was done. Drago's character is portrayed as cold, quite one dimensional. He says very little, in contrast to Apollo, who's very full of pride, and Mr. T, who's very aggressive. Drago is almost robotic. He says very little. The little he does say is pretty cold. Um, anyway, and I'll come back to these points because it's significant for the recut. Anyway, it's not an overly complicated film. Rocky then goes to Russia. He doesn't get officially sanctioned because Drago's an amateur and because one man is dead. So he's not officially sanctioned, so he goes to Moscow. Um, Christmas Eve, and there's a whole Cold War thing, the Russian crowd's very hostile to the American, as the American crowd was to the Russian, and it's one of the best fights ever seen on screen. It's just so the adrenaline, the for me one of the best things about that film was the soundtrack. So I came into this film kind of I don't know really what I expected, but of course I was going to check it out. Um, And I'll just say right now that my overall view is the original, i.e., the unedited version, was better. Um, I've just listened to an interview with Sylvester Stallone as to his reasoning for doing this, and some of it makes sense, but with all due respect to Stallone, I think that it wasn't really necessary. I think that the original was good as it was, and I appreciate the reasons that he stated. So, again, for anyone who hasn't seen the edited version, maybe stop watching now because this will be some spoilers. Um, some of the most iconic scenes are still there. So the famous training montage, which I believe was actually shot in Wyoming, because obviously the Cold War was still going on, so they couldn't shoot in Russia. Um, but that's a famous scene that was intact. A lot of other scenes were intact. The opening, I think, spent too much time on Mr. T and the flashback there. I just think there was too much time spent on it. Whereas the opening to Rocky Four was quite brisk. The iconic gloves scene, that's taken out. Stallone has said it was a bit over the top, a bit 80s, and it was. But the thing is, that's what people liked about it. We know it was over the top. We know it was very dramatic and exploding gloves. It's a very 80s film. But you know what? It was the best of the 80s, and it worked really well. So I don't think it needed to be changed. I mean, it's an iconic opening scene. As it stood, there wasn't really much of an opening in this one. There was a flashback, which I think was too prolonged. I just don't think it was necessary. There are some scenes that were interesting to watch. For example, if you've seen the original, the scene where Adrian's sort of arguing with Rocky and Apollo about this idea of taking on this challenge. She says, you know, Apollo, you're a great fighter, but how much can you take, either of you? She's basically saying, you know, accept the fact that you're older men now. You've nothing else to prove. Just, you know, be safe, basically. And she goes to the kitchen. Now, in this version, it actually shows Rocky follow her, and have a whole conversation in that regard. And she says she respects Apollo, but he's only doing it not for, as he says, propaganda reasons to sort of show that the Americans are stronger, but for personal reasons. Because he's a guy, Apollo Creed was always modeled as a sort of Muhammad Ali type figure, an excellent fighter, um, larger than life, quite egotistical. Um, you know, there was clear analogies there with Muhammad Ali, and I think that that scene was quite interesting. So that was good to watch. The robot was taken out. There's a scene where Rocky gives his difficult brother-in-law Paulie a robot, which again is very symbolic of the 80s. It's a bit cheesy, but again, it's fun, you know. One thing I didn't like about this recut was it was a little too dark. Now, there are dark aspects of the film. A man dies in the ring, and bear in mind this is only a few years after the South Korean fighter Kim Duk-jo. Kim Duk-jo, I believe his name was. I'll just double check that. But that, you know, that was only coming 3 years after that. Actually, 2 years, 1983, that guy died. Um, so some might say it was a little insensitive, but it worked in terms of the script. Um, I'll just double check that because it's an important point. Yeah, Kim Duk-koo. Kim Duk-koo. So he died in a fight with Ray Mancini in 1983. This was released in 1985, so perhaps, you know, some critics of the film have said that was insensitive. I don't feel it was necessarily deliberately insensitive. It just showed the reality boxing is a dangerous sport. It also was trying to stress that Drago was not a normal fighter, and he's a cold figure. Now, like I say, a lot of the stuff was intact. There was a little bit more of conversations with Duke, Apollo's manager. He had a little bit more screen time, I think, so did Adrian. Some of those secondary characters got a little bit more screen time. Was that the right decision? I'm not sure. I understand the logic for it, and they're good characters, they're strong characters. Um, when we got into the main fight, I think it was essentially the same. I don't think anything was different, and it was, you know, just incredible fight. Um, but for some inexplicable reason, Stallone chose to end the film with Eye of the Tiger rather than, I believe it was Hearts on Fire, a Survivor. Now, Eye of the Tiger is a great song, but it is very much associated with Rocky 3, not Rocky 4. So I'm not really sure why he chose to do that. Did play Hearts on Fire afterwards, but by that point, a lot of people will have got up. Um, the thing about Hearts on Fire, it's a very uplifting song, and that ties in with Stallone's optimistic speech. In here, there were two guys killing each other, um, and if I can change, like if you can change, because he's talking about how the crowd changed the sentiments during the fight, then we can all change. It was almost like an optimistic note of, you know, the two superpowers coming together and finding some sort of detente. So Eye of the Tiger just didn't really fit in with that. Although it's a great song, it just didn't fit in with that scene. There is one little bit which we thought was good where Rocky kind of goes over to Drago, kind of checks if he's okay. And actually, there is some other little nuances in the fight. It shows Drago's mood slowly changing. Now, in the original, he gets angry because Um, his trainer calls him an idiot and sort of shoves his head, and then Drago realizes, wait, I'm just being used here. Why the hell should I suffer for these guys? I'll do it for myself. But of course, in the Soviet Union, that's dissent, you know. And Stallone said he probably ended up in a gulag. In fact, the original ending was of Drago. Again, a spoiler here, was even darker. He got dependent on drugs and he ended up committing suicide, which was, I suppose, realistic, but definitely a downer. Um, so, if anyone's seen Creed 2, um, which of course involves Drago's son, this recut ending, it kind of, I guess it leads more towards that Creed 2 film, whereas the original Rocky 4 is a little bit ambiguous. We assume, you know, Drago's in disgrace. He's lost a fight. He's insulted his premier. He's went against his own trainers, and the crowd's against him. So, you know, he's kind of a tragic figure in that sense. And by the time of Creed 2, his wife is, you know, she's as cold as she was in the first film. You know, instead of standing by her man, she just buggers off. So, you actually feel quite sorry for Drago. Now, in this recut version, he's a bit more humanized. He's less robotic. He's still this menacing, cold figure, but you see that he, you know, there's scenes, for example, when he's in a Apollo Creed exhibition match and the Americans are booing him. He's hurt by it, which is a normal reaction. He's a bit, you know, little bit uneasy about it. You could see in his eyes. Whereas in the original film, he was a bit too robotic. So maybe that humanization of Drago was a good thing. Um, his original character, if we're being honest, was quite one-dimensional. Very memorable, great character, but still one-dimensional. So all in all, I've just watched this interview. Stallone said he felt the original was too rushed. Actually, this new cut is only 2 minutes longer, so the time difference is very minimal. Um, all in all, I have to say I preferred the original. One thing I've noticed about martial arts films in general in recent years, it's true of the Rocky series, it's probably true. I haven't seen too many other martial arts films, but contrast them to the 80s. Now, if you take Rocky 3, Rocky 4, Rocky 5, 1990, and I know that scene is kind of the least good of the Rocky films. I actually think it's underrated, but that's for another film. That's for another video. I think Rocky 5 is a fine film myself. But anyway, you know, they all have an uplifting ending. Other examples is Bloodsport, Kickboxer, the Van Damme films. They're really uplifting endings. You know, the protagonist wins, it's feel good music, it's all good. Now, the two Creed films, especially Creed 2, it's a bit of a downer of an ending. It kind of shows Drago and his son kind of jogging off into the distance, and there's no feel good music to that. And it's something, I think there's a fun that's been taken out of films in recent years. Um, and it's not that Rocky 4 was meant to be a comedy, it's a serious film, it's a sports drama, but it did have light-hearted moments and it did have definitely an optimistic feel to it. This cut felt darker. It felt more, almost more like the first two Rocky films, which were fine films, but they were a product of their time. Um, they were very much had that 70s era about them. So I don't really think that this added anything new. I mean, there's a whole scene in the Boxing Board of Control where it's kind of just stating the obvious, and it's drawn out a bit more where Rocky's trying to convince him to get that he can get a license. They refuse, and understandably so. I mean, they don't want, uh, you know, the conscience of having a man's death on their hands, so they refuse him a license. And it's a good 5 minutes. I think it's interesting, but it's not really necessary. What else? There's a few more shots of Rocky's mansion, which you don't really see in the first film, which is interesting. It's not really necessary, but it's interesting. You see big marble lions in the front. So some of the camera work's a bit different, but all in all, I prefer the 1985 version because I think as much as I respect Stallone as a filmmaker and I respect his reasoning for this, because he wanted to give, for example, Adrian into a um, more weight, I think that all in all, a lot of people with nostalgia for that first film, they don't see it as cheesy. They liked it for what it was. It's a great film. It's an uplifting film, not for Drago, so perhaps one thing that is an improvement is the humanization of Drago. And I think if I would include just one thing that's different from the original. It's that bit at the end where Rocky kind of goes over to check if, well, not quite check if Drago's all right, but as he's leaving his ring, he sort of acknowledges and respects Drago. It's a nice touch, and it's very much in keeping with Rocky's character. And it kind of gives us some hope about Drago, like maybe it won't be so bad after all. But of course, as we learn in Creed 2, his life's fallen apart. Drago's quite a tragic figure, and that's something I didn't like in Creed 2. Was there vindication for Drago's character? I'm not sure that there was. So I don't know. I mean, I love the Rocky series. There isn't a single Rocky film, and I'm including Rocky 5, by the way, which I dislike. They're all good. The two Creed films, all the Rocky films. Um, I'll just quickly mention Rocky 5 because, well, I did. I've made another video about it, but I feel quite strongly about it. Everyone tends to rubbish Rocky 5, even Stallone does. He basically disowned it. But when you think about it, there's nothing wrong with that film. I think it's because it's coming just after Rocky 4, which was such a good film. Rocky 5, you have an upcoming young fighter, played by the actual boxer Tommy Morrison, Tommy Gunn. And he's sort of like a white Mike Tyson in the sense he's a loose cannon. He's a power puncher, he's very powerful, but he's also troubled and he's got a quick temper. So a little bit like a young Mike Tyson. But basically, Rocky basically brings him into his home, welcomes him, and he keeps badgering Rocky to train him, and Rocky eventually does, to the point where he's abandoning his own son. Um, but long story short, it's very much about the world of corruption in boxing, which the other films don't really show to the same extent. Um, I think people dislike the fact that it ended in a street fight rather than a fight in the ring, which maybe they felt was outside the Rocky character. But it's a good street fight. I mean, it's memorable, notwithstanding what I've said about real world street fights. But in terms of cinematically, it's well done. Soundtrack is really good in that movie. I keep talking about soundtracks because I think they are they make a film. I think they're a very important point, an underrated point. And actually, Tommy Morrison, considering he wasn't a professional actor, he was very good at Tommy Gunn. I thought he really got into that role. So it's a pity Rocky Five gets such jibes. It's really not that bad. It's not the best. It's not Rocky Four, but in its own right, I think it's a good glimpse into the world of corruption, of friendship, of betrayal, of all these things. It's a good film, and I don't know why it gets such slack. Even from the man himself, it doesn't really make sense. But anyway, that's just my opinion. So that's my verdict on Rocky versus Drago, the director's cut. I understand the reasons. I just think the original, don't change what's not broken. Don't fix what's not broken.